If you guys have been following my page for a while, you know that we built our own home. We bought vacant land, designed the plans, and then built the house ourselves with the help of a contractor friend. Well, this is just inside our entryway, and I've always had the goal of adding some beams in the ceiling, but this has been a project that's waited till the end, and it's time to do it now. We purchased these polyurethane faux wood beams off of homedepot.com, and they have a wood finish. They did come in two different finishes, either this natural, which doesn't have any color to it, or you could order them in a wood finish. The wood finish didn't match the colors in my house, so I chose to go with the natural, and I'm going to go ahead and color these myself. This is my fireplace mantle that I'm looking to sort of get close to in tone. So I looked at the colors that are in this wood here. And then I also looked at my tile floors. These are a wood look tile. And so I looked at some of the colors that are in here. And I took cues from these when I was planning my colors that I'm going to use in my wood beams. So I did order this sample beam along with the actual beams themselves. I ordered this to see that I liked the look, and then also I've been using it to play around with some paint colors. And so this is kind of the color that I came up with using my Wysall 1 hour enamel that I'm going to use on the final beams. I made sure and I looked at it in all different types of light at different times of day, held it up and down to make sure that I liked the finish, because these are going to go up on my ceiling and this will show me how it will look. So I definitely recommend, if you're doing a project like this, to take advantage and grab one of the samples as well. The color that I'm using for these is from Wysall Paint, and it's their 1 hour enamel line, which is an all-in-one style paint that will not require sealing. It dries to a satin finish, and this color is called Leatherwood. Beautiful brown that's going to match the wood tones in my home. And I started out trying to roll this with a flocked roller, but it was hard to get into all these crevices on here. So I'm going to end up brushing these, I think. So I've got my roller tray out, and let's go ahead and get started on this brushing. So I'm going to just fill my brush just to about that mid mark there, a little bit of paint on it. And then this brush is on extremely easy. I'm actually getting coverage on this in one coat. I plan to use 2 colors on this finish, and this base coat is getting coverage in just this first coat, which I'm thrilled with, because that will mean I have plenty of paint left over. To do just my entryway, I did have 4 of these beams to do, so I'm never afraid to ask for help, and this was also nice to have some company out in my workspace with me. We did end up brushing all 4 of these beams. Spraying would have been another option that would have worked, but I only had 1 quart of paint and I wanted to make sure I got through them all. You can see here how the rolling didn't quite work. It didn't get into all those crevices. And here I am, I got down just to the end of that can of paint and I had just enough for these 4 beams. I'm so relieved. But this finish isn't done yet. That was just my base coat. Now we're going to lighten this up and make these look a little bit more like real wood. So my next color in this layered finish is going to be called Fauna. And this is a beautiful creamy mushroom color that's also new in the 1 hour enamel line from Wysall Paint. You can see here how the contrast between the leatherwood and the fauna is going to be perfect to give me all of those beautiful wood tones to look like natural wood beams. So what I'm going to do here is brush on a color wash of the fauna, and that means I'm just going to put on a super thin layer. So I went ahead and used a little bit of water to thin out this 1 hour enamel for that color wash. I'm going to brush it into all those crevices of that wood beam, and I'm going to just work in small sections at a time because I don't want my paint to start setting up, and I want to be able to wipe this back and just leave that fauna, that creamy mushroom color, in just the crevices of this wood. So now I need to repeat this same process on all 4 of my beams, working in small sections at a time, and each one of these beams has 3 sides on it. So this was kind of a lengthy process, and it was one that I could only do with a brush. There was no option for a roller or a sprayer on this. Once I wipe that paint away, you can see here how it deposits all that creamy mushroom color into the crevices of the wood, and it starts looking more and more like real wood with every step along the way. You can see here how detailed some of these beams are, how many crevices they had. I needed to make sure that I brushed into all of them, and that little bit of water that I'm giving just helps thin out the paint so that it finds all those low points in the beam itself. There was a lot of arm work in this one. At this point, I'm getting a little tired of brushing because you can imagine I brushed the base coat on all 4 beams, and now I'm coming back and doing this color wash on all 3 sides of them. But the result was so gratifying. I really love how these 2 colors came together. It was exactly the look that I was hoping for. I focused on just one side of the beam at a time, and then once I had the top finished, I went ahead and rotated it onto each side. This 1-hour enamel dries fairly quickly to the touch, and so I was able to do this all in one step and get them all done in one evening with a few hours of work. I found it easier to do in one setting, and that way I made sure that I got my finishes consistent, whereas sometimes if you step away, you could change your hand and end up getting inconsistent finishes. For wiping away this color wash, I was just using an old t-shirt, and this worked really well. I kept my hand fairly flat and ran it over the top of the beam just to remove that creamy white paint just from the top of the surface and leaving it in those crevices. I didn't want to wash it away completely. I just really wanted to wash away the top to expose some of that leatherwood paint underneath. But this was not my final step in the process. I still had one more step to go, and you can see here how the beams change from each step. I've got the first coat of leatherwood, then my color wash, and this final version is where I'm going with it. Each layer that I added a little more depth and dimension and a little more realism, and I feel like this first one just takes it over the top and makes these look like real wood. So what's my final step on these? It's a little bit of glaze, and this color is black. I'm going to use a natural bristle brush for this process, and that's just because I want a little bit of coarseness to the bristles that's just going to wisp over the top of some of this texture. I took a tiny bit of my black glaze just in the lid of my container, and I'm going to dry brush it over the top so it catches just the ridges of this design. This is going to give me that third layer of depth and dimension. So at this point, I've got the leatherwood as my base. I've got the fauna as a color wash that found those low points. And then this dry brushing of the glaze is going to find just the high points of the beam. This is going to really emphasize some of those knots and things in the wood that would make it look like it was outside and weathered naturally. So once again, I went about repeating the same process on all 4 beams on all 3 sides, just dry brushing a little bit of that glaze over the top of the ridges on the beam. You can see when I dry brush over the areas how it catches the certain high points and it brings them out even more. These are great universal techniques that I use in a lot of finishes. I use a highlight and a low light, and that's exactly what I'm doing here. My highlight is going to be that light color that settled into those low points, and then my low light is going to be the stark color that I'm dry brushing over the top. Color washing and dry brushing are also 2 techniques that I use a lot of. So the color wash was that diluted paint that settled into the low points, and then this dry brushing is using an extremely dry brush to just feather over the top of these design. These are my finished beams. I love the consistent look. I love how the glaze hit the high points. These are ready to hang, and this is the hard part. We did need to hang some furring strips in the ceiling, and this is going to be what we attach the beams into. 2x6 lumber would have been what fit on the inside of this, but lumber is extremely expensive, and using the smaller wood and creating a channel down the center actually ended up being quite a bit cheaper than buying the 2x6 lumber, so we went ahead and did it that way. I decided to lay out my design in an X pattern in my entryway. I felt like this would draw attention to the light fixture in the center, and so that's what we're going to do. We set up the scaffolding back in the entry of the house. I didn't miss having scaffolding up for a while, but I'm glad to be getting this project done. This was a 2-person job, 1 person to hold it, mark the measurements, and then come back and cut the wood. We started out by marking the pattern on the ceiling, and of course we got some help on the scaffolding along the way. So for cutting, Sean made a template of each corner because they're not all exactly 90-degree corners. Of course, it's pretty normal with walls that they're not going to be exactly perfectly straight. And then he made a template, and that's what he's cutting from. And then it does require a little bit of carving out from the underside of the beam so that it'll go into that corner. And oddly, one side of the inside is wider than the other, so he had to notch that a little bit too. We weren't counting on that being a fact. So that is how we're doing cuts. He's got the miter saw out, but primarily using the oscillating saw. Our design is actually going into a rectangular shape, and so it's not going to be equal on both sides. So you'll notice one of the cuts is up here and the other one is up here to get into those corners. The initial cut he's doing about 1 inch larger than the measurement because we will put it up in that corner and then can always trim it down from there, but want to make sure we get that initial cut a little larger. With the beams cut, we hung them one at a time. We did this long piece that goes across the center first, just hung it using decking screws that go through the side of the beam and into the wood underneath. Once the beams were hung, we did have a couple areas that were seamed together, and this was one of them on the longest portion. So I started out by filling this with a little bit of caulking. I used a dark brown caulking. This ended up not being exactly the right shade, but that's okay because I'm going to paint over the top of it. So I started out by using the same steps that I used on the beam overall, and I gave it a coat of my leatherwood as a base. The leatherwood covered over this orange tone caulking really easily, and that got rid of that tone because it really stood out like a sore thumb. I'm standing up on the scaffolding doing this touch-up, which wasn't the easiest thing because I was looking up the entire time, but I'm really happy with how the touch-up turned out. You can't even tell that there's a seam there. Once I let that leatherwood dry, I came back with my fauna and added that a little bit of a wash over the top, and I'm going to go ahead and wipe that back using a rag. I tried not to wipe it nice and clean around that seam because I don't want to emphasize it. I'm trying to camouflage that, and so I don't want that line to stand out. The ceiling in this entryway is actually a 12-foot ceiling, and so from down on the floor, you're not even going to really see this, so I just need to hide it good enough. We're looking at it really close up, so you have to mind that from down at the ground level, you're not even going to notice where this is. And then I just did a little bit of that dry brushing over the top to emphasize those same high points, and it gave me the same look as the rest of the beam. This photo is standing down at ground level, and you can see here that it's barely noticeable where that seam is. I also had a seam in the center of my X pattern where the beams crossed together, and I wanted to make this look sort of like charred wood. So I took a little bit of my Wiesel 1 hour enamel, and this color is called wrought iron. It's a dark charcoal gray, and I just lightly dry brushed with a natural bristle chip brush along the edges of that beam. With this project complete, we've rehung our light fixture. Let's take a spin around the room. Just kidding, this will make you dizzy really fast. I'm thrilled with how this project came out. It really draws your eye up into the room. I still have my great room to do, so this project is not over. You guys can find links for everything I use in the description for this post. If you enjoyed this video, I hope you'll click that subscribe button. As always, you can find more Brush by Brandy on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and YouTube, and on my website at brushbybrandy.com.